So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go through the Team Explorer process to get my application up on GitHub. Okay. So if you don't have this Team Explorer window, you can turn it on through View and Team Explorer. And if you click on Home, the first thing you need to do is enter your Git credentials. So from Home, if you go to the Settings and go to the Global Settings, this will ask you to enter your GitHub username and your GitHub email. Once you save this, it will probably also pop up a GitHub authentication window asking you for your GitHub password. So you only have to do this once. This is global for all your projects. You don't have to do this on every project. So again, under Home and Settings and Global Settings, and you'll enter your GitHub username and email address. So that connects your Visual Studio to GitHub. The other option you will see down here that might be different from mine, notice mine shows a little Git icon and it has the name of my project. If you don't have this, you may have a separate option down here that says Add to Source Control. So if you want to create a new repository, you just click that button that says Add to Source Control. I've already done it, so my option for that has disappeared. So when I want to make new changes in Team Explorer, I click on Home and Changes. And I can put in a commit message right here in Team Explorer. So validate category model. So this is lesson 2. Validate category model. Add category form. So then to make a new commit, I can just click commit all. That makes a local commit, and then it's prompting me to sync to my online GitHub repo. So I'll click sync. And it says there's one outgoing commit that I just made for lesson 2. Guess this should be lesson 3, but I called it lesson 2. And then I'm just going to push my commit. And it tells me I've successfully pushed. If I go to the GitHub repository, you can see that my project was just updated. And we can see I have a commit called L2, should have been L3. So now every time I make a new commit, every time I want to save new changes, I can just go to Team Explorer, go to Home and Changes, and I just enter a message, click commit, and then I click sync and push. That's it. If you want to use the command prompt, you still can, and all of the commands are on D2L. If you need them inside of the Tools and Resources folder, all the typical GitHub commands are still here, so you can still use your terminal, your command window. So in Tools and Resources, here are the commands, same ones we used in our PHP class. Doesn't change. Team Explorer is simpler because you don't have to really do any typing. The only typing you're doing is the commit message. Okay. So I want to set up a local, both a local and an Azure database for the beer store. You can use either one. I'm going to use my local database because the site's going to run more quickly connecting locally, but I'll also show you how we would set up a database on Azure, and then next week we'll actually connect the projects. to these. So I'm going to open up Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. Doesn't matter what version of this you have. And first I'm going to connect to my local server. So you typically get this window popping up. So it asks you, what server do you want to connect to? So I want to connect to my local server. So I'm going to put in for me, it's my computer name. Typically you can connect with just with the server name of local. But for this, you have to have your SQL running. Now, when you install the SQL Server Database Engine, you get two options. The first option is Windows authentication. That's the default. So if you left that option, you just connect with Windows authentication and you don't require any username and password. If you set up your SQL server to use a username and password, then you would choose SQL Server Authentication. The default login, the username is always SA, which stands for System Admin. And then you would have been prompted to enter a password at the time you installed the database engine component. If you check Remember Password, then you won't get prompted to enter it every time you go to connect to the database. That password will be stored. So to try this out, I'll click Connect. So once this happens, I have a connection. My SQL server, my local server is running. And it shows me in this window here called the Object Explorer. Here's my server. So under databases, I have a bunch of local databases. And I can create a new database. So if I right-click Databases, I can choose New Database. And I'll just call it Beer Store. So I just enter a name. The name should not have any spaces in it. And then I just click OK. So now I have a new empty database on my local server. If you want to check if SQL Server is running, because your server, by default, when you install SQL Server, it automatically runs every time you start your operating system. So my SQL Server is already running, which is why I could just open Management Studio and connect to it. If you want to check if it's running, you can search for your Windows services. So I did a search for services. And in here, the services that should run on startup are these. So here's my SQL server. This is actually the database server. It tells me, Windows tells me it's running and that the startup type is automatic. So every time I boot Windows, my local SQL Server engine runs. Okay. So if your SQL Server, if you've installed it and it's not running, you need to right-click and choose Start. You won't be able to connect to the server if the server isn't running. Again, you don't have to do this. You can use Azure, but for the Beer Store, the work is going to be faster if you have your database running locally. I can actually connect to the database. Yes, Ryan. Okay. Let me close out of here, so I'll disconnect. So when you first open Management Studio, you'll get this window. So you can probably use these options. try local in brackets as the server name. And you should be able to just leave authentication as Windows authentication. Then just click connect. So the only thing you should have to do here is type the word local in round brackets. The authentication will default to Windows authentication. So unless you change this option when you install the SQL Server, Windows is the default. So mine won't connect, but yours should. I can actually see my database in Visual Studio as well. It's very slow. Management Studio works much better. But in Visual Studio, I have this Server Explorer window here, which I can turn on through the View menu. So in Server Explorer, again, I could, under my under data connections, if I add a connection, I can connect through here. So again, if I'll pick local, and I can authenticate through here as well, if you want to use Visual Studio. I can test my connection. So Visual Studio can now see my database as well. Visual Studio is just really slow for this. It's not recommended. So there's a local database that I could create my tables in. We're going to create the tables next week. We're not going to build the beer store tables this week. Just wanted to show you how to set the database up. I'm now going to go through the same process, but this time I'm going to set up my beer store database in the Azure portal. So I'm going to show you that. So I'm going to log in to my account at portal.azure.com. So for your assignment, when you create your database, the database is going to have to run on Azure or some other live server. But we do have some credits, $100 worth of credits to use on the Azure server. So I'm going to create a database now, but once it's created, I'm going to connect to it in Management Studio, and then I'm going to stop it on Azure, because every hour the database runs, it uses up our credits. So if I'm not working on the project right now, I don't want the database running. So right here under Azure Services, I want SQL database. So I'm going to create one. So I'm going to use my Azure for Students subscription. It asks for a resource group. Yours will probably be blank. So I'm going to create a new one. I'll create a beer store group. I'll call my database beer store. Oh, it doesn't want it to be. And then it will ask me to pick a server. I'll pick any server. It gives me Central Canada. My Elastic pool, I'll just default to no. And under configure, I want to make sure I pick the lowest, like their free tier, so it doesn't eat up my resources. I'm going to click on configure. Yeah, I don't want this option that they're recommending me for the low price of $545 a month. I want this basic standard premium. I want the basic. I'm not sure why it's giving me this cost exactly. I don't think it's going to... charge you, I'll just create it and then I'll probably take it down. So then I'm going to create my database. And then I'll need to set up a username and password so that I can access the database. So I'm going to go to my database. You may have been prompted to enter a username and password for your database. Not sure why it didn't prompt me. The other thing we need to do is, by default, the databases on Azure don't allow remote connections. So once my database is set up, I have this button here that says Set Server Firewall. I'm going to click that button, and I'm going to say allow Azure services to access this server. That's yes. And I want to allow all IP addresses. So I've created a rule under rule name, and I'm going to allow any IP address that has the username and password to access it. And then I'm going to click Save under the firewall settings. If I don't do this, my own laptop can't connect to the database. So now I'm going to try to connect using Management Studio. So it gives me the server name right here, which I'm going to copy. I'm going to go back to Management Studio. And under here, under Registered Servers, I'm going to right click and I'm going to make a new server registration. I'm going to paste in my server name. I'm going to change the authentication to SQL Server authentication. And then I'm going to enter the username and password here that I created in the Azure portal. And now if I click Test, my Management Studio is connecting to the database that I just set up in the Azure portal. I can also give this a friendly name. So I'm going to call this Azure Beer Store. And then I'll save it. So every week now that I've saved the server address and the username and password, every week in class, I'll just close Management Studio. If I want to be able to connect and look at the database at any time, I open Management Studio. And I can just cancel this login screen. And I can go over, here's my Azure Beer Store. I can just double click it and this will connect to me. I know I don't have to enter the username and the password each time. So here's my Beer Store database. There are no tables in it yet, but we'll put tables in it next week. You can see it's slower connecting to Azure. When I connect to my local database, it's much faster. It takes a minute to bring up the list of tables in Azure. If I want to connect to my local database, it's pretty much instant. There's no lag time. So here's my local beer store. Here's my online beer store. So I'm going to stop my server here, my online beer store, because we're not going to work with it at all until next week. And it's using up resources in my Azure portal. So for now, I'm going to remove this database, or at least I'll stop the database so that I'm not paying Microsoft for it right now. So next week, what we're going to do is we're going to connect up our Beer Store MVC application so it can start using the database. But I'm going to do this locally. I'm not going to do it with Azure. I want it to run locally to conserve my Azure credits and also so things work faster when we're going through the lessons. Okay, so that's everything for today. I know a lot of you have class. I'm just going to get rid of this database for now. I know a lot of you have class at 4. If you have questions, I will hang around in the room for a little while. I will get working on marking assignment 1A, and other than that, I will see you guys next week.